Welcome to Vessel Performance Optimization's webinar, Improving Data Quality in Vessel Performance and Compliance Projects, from our sponsors Navtor. We're joined by our guest speaker today, Holton, Vice President of Navtor. If you have any questions for him, please leave them in the Q&A box on your screen for a reply. Here is our host, Carl Jeffrey from Digital Ship, to explain more.
Hey, our subject today is data quality management in vessel performance. So first question is, why do we need good quality data? Well, if we want to make the right operational and investment decisions about how to reduce emissions and improve performance, we need good data. And if we want to show and convince our charterers, investors and banks that our shipping company is on a pathway to net zero, we need good quality data. And perhaps regulators are going to be scrutinizing the quality of data that we're reporting. Now, we're hearing lots of companies have been gathering what they think is good performance data, sometimes for years, and then when they start to analyze it, they find it's completely useless, the data is incomplete or calibrated wrongly, or it's just been provided wrongly, perhaps intentionally. But lots of people have been thinking for years about what good data quality means and how to get there, particularly in the oil and gas industry, and we can draw on some of that expertise. It's probably not something we can fix purely with technology method. More likely, it needs a lot of thorough hard work. You probably need a flexible data collection process, a means of checking the data as you gather it, perhaps KPIs to assess how good your data is, and a company culture around data quality. If you've got automated data collection, that's probably better than manual methods, but you can't rely on it completely because you can have an automated system set up wrong to collect bad data. And our speaker today is Holton. He's Vice President of Navtor, based in Dallas, Texas. You might know Navtor mainly for its electronic navigation products, but joined the company through Trez Solutions, a vessel performance software company he co-founded and which Navtor acquired in early 2021. And he was previously a management consultant. And I saw on his LinkedIn page that he's also a former professional golfer. So that's the first we've had on our webinars. He's going to do a presentation for about 25 minutes, and there should be plenty of time for questions afterwards. And it's very early in the morning for Aaron, so he's asked to please keep the questions nice and easy. You can put the questions in the Q&A box at any time. And I'd like to invite Aaron to start his talk. Cheers.
Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Let me share my screen. So I think Carl gave a fantastic introduction in terms of what we would like to discuss today. Data is not always an exciting topic to talk about, or data quality in particular, but I think it's something worth speaking more about because as a business and having been in this industry for quite some time now, you see a lot of varying approaches for how to do it, and all with kind of different levels of results. So as we mentioned, today's topic really talking about how we improve data quality for vessel performance and compliance initiatives. And so the agenda today and kind of how we thought we would go through this would be to, number one, talk about the importance of a flexible data collection and validation process for vessel performance, discuss KPIs that any company should focus on to improve data quality, regardless of the path you choose, whether you build your own system, whether you use third-party systems. I think having KPIs in place are really important to being able to monitor the effectiveness of whatever collection and validation strategy you use. We'd also plan to share some case studies of how shipping companies have addressed data quality issues over the past several years, and then also talk about how Navtor's Navfleet software and services help improve data quality and decision-making in line with the subject here today. So we've conducted kind of a semi-formal poll over the last year or so around data quality in general when it comes to companies. And so this interview, we had roughly 62 different conversations with different shipping companies. These are different logos that included owners, operators, technical managers, and charterers. So kind of spanning the gamut of those that typically use new and equivalent data for either performance or compliance related projects. And so number one, 100% of the people that we spoke with said that their companies collect some noon report equivalent data in some form. So this could be email, Excel, an internal system that they have developed, or a third-party system similar to Navtor or others. So everybody's collecting data. However, 89% of the same people that we spoke with question the accuracy of their noon report data. Further, 77% of the respondents believe that compliance is challenging due to data quality issues. So by challenging, what that typically means is that at the end of the year, whenever they're, say, putting together a report when it comes to IMO DCS or EU MRV compliance, they spend an inordinate amount of time trying to validate or follow up on data, very old data at this point, and try to make heads or tails of it, which is a frustrating and challenging process for the people that are doing that. And then last but not least, 94% of shipping companies say that their company has faced negative consequences due to missing data, erroneous data, or not understanding the data in general. And so what this means, negative consequences in this case, when we ask for examples, can be large charter party claims, in particular, was quite often used, making hull cleaning decisions based on incorrect or misleading information, or even setting up a charter or fixture based on erroneous information. And so all of this to say that everyone's collecting data, but there's certainly, I think, where the breakdown occurs is that people don't trust it. And in our view, and kind of in line with the topic today, a lot of that is due to the fact that validation processes aren't necessarily always in place for that data. Data is critical. I think everybody can agree with that. And we think that there are three reasons that we want to highlight why we see that it's important, or particularly important for our businesses. Number one is for regulation and compliance. If you pull up a digital ship webpage or VPO, you're going to see a lot of discussions around the latest regulations. So CII, EEXI, the EU emissions trading system, and then historically EU MRV and IMO DCS. The regulatory landscape is constantly changing and evolving, which is putting a greater emphasis on compliance. And to comply, it becomes very time consuming for companies, and in many ways costly to keep up with these regulations. And so data is very important in order to satisfy these regulatory obligations. In addition, we see increasing shareholder pressure. So whether you're a publicly traded or a private company, there's increasing calls for environmental efficiency among shareholders. We see it with customers as well. So charterers are increasingly making decisions based on the environmental efficiency of vessels, and will certainly continue to do so in the future. And then, of course, alongside calls for environmental efficiency, there's longstanding desires for profitability and financial performance. And so companies are forced to find ways to become more energy efficient, all of which can be helped or improved through data. And then finally, kind of slightly tied to the shareholder pressure, is business competitive. So we see competition for cargoes increasing, and so companies are required to differentiate themselves versus their competitors. And so this can be through compliance or demonstrated performance. Sea Cargo Charter is a great example of this, where there's a lot more transparency in terms of the activities of the different companies. And so it gives charterers a way, or it gives companies a way to evaluate these different charterers. And then also you have other industry players. It may be technical managers. It can even be companies like Navtor in our competitive landscape that need to prove that they are different in order to win and maintain business. And so it's very difficult to prove your differentiation or to have competitive differentiation without good and reliable data. So I think data can be collected and captured in different ways. Much of this we may already know. As Carl said, there's the option to gather data through manual means. So this would be low frequency data, typically your 24-hour noon report or equivalent. You can collect data via automation, so high frequency data. So you're sampling through sensors on both the bridge and the engine control room at a much higher frequency. It can be 15 minutes, it can be an hour, but essentially you're getting data points at a higher rate. And then a lot of the data that goes into the downstream analysis and I shaded it differently for a reason because we probably won't talk about it so much today, is third-party data from either AIS or third-party weather providers. So all of this can go into vessel reporting and then in your performance or compliance analytics. Now, you're collecting this data, but how are you capturing it and then transmitting this to the various stakeholders? There are a number of different options, and for simplification, we've tried to summarize these into 3 different tools that we typically see in our business, and they range from in sophistication, varying from kind of low, very easy, to a little bit higher sophistication. One is email. There are still plenty of companies out there that we talk to that their primary form of reporting kind of vessel operational data is through email. So there's typically a handful of parameters that a vessel will send daily to shore teams, and these could be technical stakeholders, commercial stakeholders, or operational stakeholders. Very simple, very crude, and these typically don't have any system-based validations. They may be validated ashore, but again, very simple. We also see quite a bit of spreadsheet use, believe it or not, still in the market. So companies may have very simple, sometimes even a little bit more sophisticated Excel forms where they're gathering slightly larger data sets than they would, say, via email, with varying levels of data validation. So often the validations we see in these spreadsheets may be just basic text or numeric validations, but nothing too detailed here. So again, potential limitations that we'll talk about here in a bit. And then kind of at the higher end are our software systems. These can be in-house or third-party developed solutions. What you typically see in these is at least the extension or the benefit is that it would capture a more standardized set of data. So you could expect the same data every day, or at least the same data tags in theory. But we do see a huge range of data validation from none to much more sophisticated, and we can talk about what those are. But at least the software systems typically offer the most flexibility, especially when it comes to being able to incorporate different types of data. So low frequency data, high frequency data, or a combination of the two. Now, I think the viewpoint, and I honestly even had the same viewpoint when I joined the industry, is that automated data collection is always better. But what we have found over the years is that both manual data collection and automated data collection can be used to benefit a company's performance or compliance objectives, and both have their limitations. So automated data collection is not a silver bullet for data quality. So I'll talk about the benefits and limitations. For manual data collection, some of the benefits: it's quick and easy to deploy, typically very cost effective, and it can support compliance and many high impact performance initiatives. So high impact meaning that you can still use it if validated properly for your whole performance monitoring programs for certain engine, looking at auxiliary engine usage or boiler or other things. You can still do a lot with manual data collection that will have tangible benefits for your company. Downsides, I think, are generally understood. Low frequency means that it typically takes longer to generate insights and see benefits. Once you apply filters to the data based on report period, based on weather conditions, you're often filtering out a lot of data. And so it naturally will take a little bit longer to amass big enough data sets for meaningful insights and takeaways. The others, as Carl mentioned in his intro, manual data is subject to human error. So often we see, when we look at historical data, accidental errors. So just could be as simple as typos. Often we see intentional errors, which is a source of mistrust in the industry, especially when you consider kind of a typical charter owner relationship. There's always a belief that a lot of the data is intentionally misleading or manipulated. So this could be misreporting key information around speed, power, fuel, etc., which of course has many known impacts downstream. And then finally, even if you're reading data off of sensors, malfunctioning equipment or drift and offsets can result in inaccurate measurements. So even if translated into a manual noon report properly, it will produce false insights or erroneous insights and takeaways. From an automated data collection standpoint, the benefits, it minimizes basic data entry errors. So there's not a chance of typo in the case of automated data collection. In reality, if used properly, it can also reduce workload for crews. So Navtor has solutions that allow for auto population of noon reports using sensor data. And so this, of course, reduces the amount of effort for crews, which cannot be understated as a benefit. And then it can support more nuanced performance initiatives where high frequency data matters. So for instance, dynamic trim, dynamic speed, or RPM management is certainly a lot more challenging to do with manual data collection. And so automated data certainly has a leg up here. However, as I mentioned, it is not a end-all be-all solution for your data quality issues. The downsides of automated data collection, it can be very expensive and logistically more complex to install. This was certainly the case during the kind of the height of the COVID pandemic, but even before then, and then now after, we see a lot of challenges with long lead times for installation. And of course, if you're looking to start to make progress now with your performance or compliance initiatives, this can be a limiting factor. The same thing is with manual data collection. If you have malfunctioning equipment or drift and offset, you will have inaccurate measurements. And if it's not validated through your reporting platform, you will again be faced with the same challenges. And then also there's still potential data transfer issues due to bandwidth limitations and latency. So unless you're collecting and analyzing data on the edge, you could face challenges without the proper IT configuration or internet packages on board. And I think these last two, the pie charts, this goes to show, and I've heard the same from others, the market is still largely geared towards manual data collection. So whether we like it or not, 88% of our customer base or of all vessels under management are still using manual data collection as the primary means to gather important information. And so I think the important thing is, if you choose to employ manual data collection, it doesn't mean that you should automatically assume that everything is going to be bad. It just means that there needs to be a sound data collection and validation strategy in place to get the most out of manual data collection. And so I think that's kind of the big takeaway as we move forward, is that regardless of the chosen method, it's important to have a clear data collection and validation strategy in place. For us, we kind of think of this as kind of a five-step or five-pronged strategy that we think is important to consider. Number one, whatever you do, it should be flexible. So the solution should be adaptable to the unique specifications of every vessel. If you're using third-party forms, standard type forms that don't take into account the specific configuration of each ship can be limiting, and it also creates complications when it comes to crew buy-in and understanding of the real goals and objectives here. So ideally, you have something that's flexible in terms of the vessel type and the actual vessel specifications, but also it should be flexibly deployed. So not all vessels have great internet still to this day. And so having a solution that can work around these limitations are really important in choosing the right tool. Number two, it should be fit for purpose. And so I think it's important as organizationally to define what data tags you need, not only for your specific function, but from a broader organizational perspective, what's needed to make better decisions. So this includes operational considerations, commercial considerations, technical considerations. So it should match your current and your future aspirations as well. We often see challenges with overkill. So there may be some goals from a shoreside perspective where they want to collect huge data sets because there's all kinds of interesting and cool things that you can do with this. But if you have a vessel that's, say, a tram vessel or short voyage vessel with many kind of frequent stops, the idea that you build out these very detailed port reports, collecting all kinds of information when they have very short port stays, can be really complicated from a data collection standpoint. And so while it may be interesting and potentially useful as you're rolling out a new system, keeping it as simple as possible could help with crew buy-in and also making sure you're able to at least start collecting smaller sets of valuable data in the beginning. So making sure that the solution you choose is fit for your purpose is really critical. Number three, whatever you choose should be timely. There needs to be rules set for the frequency of reporting. How long of a gap do you want between one report and the other? Ideally, you're capturing data on a continuous basis and making sure that your operations are well understood and that things are validated, or it's difficult to monitor and validate whenever things aren't captured timely. Number four, validity of the data is critical. So you should implement a robust validation approach and ensure continuous monitoring to really find ultimate success in what you're doing. And then finally, it should be scalable. And so it's nice to collect information, but ideally you should have downstream analytics that are very intuitive, simple, and cater to multiple audiences based on a single source of truth. So whatever solution that you have, ideally it can be disseminated to other stakeholders, whether that be internally or externally. And so the flexibility to be able to integrate with other systems is ideal. So I think once you have the data collection and validation strategy in place, it's important to define KPIs for measuring the data quality. So how effective is our strategy? At Navtor, we have our own KPI scorecards, and these scorecards provide a balanced view of the reporting quality and the overall performance of a customer's fleet. So it becomes a very easy way to compare vessels on an apples to apples basis and also understand what actions need to be taken on a regular basis to be able to rectify these things. And so I think the reporting KPIs, again, should be based on your specific situation. This is showing an example of kind of a standard reporting KPI. So it looks at things like frequency of reporting, as we mentioned, when it comes to timely reporting, and also validations around stock reporting, fuel balance, main engine SFOC, power, flow meter deviations, and speed log. These are all areas where we typically see a lot of issues with reporting. So things that we think can have great benefit if monitored more closely. I'll go through a couple of examples as to the impact of bad data on a company's objectives. And so this first example, typically the way we work our process is that when we onboard a new customer, we'll typically ask for historical data just so we have a good understanding of kind of the starting point for data quality. So in this case, we're looking at a vessel or a customer's vessel data. It's about 3 months of historic data, and we're looking at main engine SFOC. In this case, they were using a third-party system, but a third-party system that did not have any data validations in place. So the vessels could essentially nearly report whatever they want. And so here you see the green line, which is the model line, and the red line, which is a 10% margin. Typically, we would ideally like to see most data points falling within this range. As it gets above the 10% margin, typically it's an indication of either reporting and or performance issues. Anything below the green line theoretically should not be possible if reporting is sound. And so on the left, you can see quite a bit of scatter of the data points, a lot of them below the theoretical minimum. When we looked at the data, we actually noticed that the vessel at times was reporting very strange information. For instance, 0 consumption while at sea, and often kind of just same consumption every day, regardless of the operation. And so in addition, the vessel did not have a torsion meter. And so we're reporting kind of their average power based on just kind of experience. And so you can see the effects of that on the data quality ashore, which led this customer to come speak with us. And so in a very short time, this is kind of a month's worth of data with filters and with some idling, so not a huge data set afterwards. But what we did was we implemented cross validations for consumption. So then starting to look at flow meter counters, reported consumption, and stock, as well as implementing an alternative method for power calculation. Given the fact that the vessel didn't have a torsion meter, you can see the data start to fall in line in a very short time. And so the difference in what you can do with this kind of information on the right versus the kind of information you see on the left is very different. In the second example, same kind of situation before taking historical data and then after view, we're looking at the engine layout curve for a tanker vessel. So here, this is comparing power and main engine RPM along the engine layout curve. Not to get into too deep of a technical dive, but the light blue line is the engine layout curve. The gray line below is the light running margin, and this first dark black line is the limit for continuous operation. So in an ideal scenario, if the vessel's data is clean, you would typically expect to see data points fall between the blue line and the first black line for kind of a laden passage noon report. And then for a vessel kind of in a ballast passage, you could see data points closer to the light running margin. In the historical data, you can see scatter all over the place. You can see things falling well below the light running margin and data points all the way up to the overload limit of the vessel. This certainly was an issue and yielded no real results for the company because they didn't trust the data, so they couldn't do a whole lot with it. So what we did was we implemented our validation process. So we started to cross-validate power and main engine RPM, which helped to also identify inconsistencies in the data gathering process. So in this case, the vessel was oddly reporting a combination of instantaneous power and average power, which led again to erroneous data. And so by us implementing this cross-validation process in a more standardized way of reporting on the vessel, you can see on the right-hand side a much tighter pattern for the data, at which point you can start to make more conclusive performance evaluations. In this case, you can use this to evaluate the health of your engine, but you can also use this as one of a few data points to even monitor the whole performance of your vessel. And the last example that we'll show here is for a bulk carrier looking at power and SFOC analysis. So the graph on the left is a combination of a before and after. And so in this case, the vessel did have a torsion meter on board, but it was malfunctioning and nobody was notified that it was malfunctioning. So you can see here, the dark blue data points show reported power and log speed. And so you can see what doesn't make any sense to most people who would be in the shipping industry is that as the vessel increased speed, the power requirement at a given speed was decreasing, which isn't logical. And so again, this wasn't identified very early in the process. And so what we did is we implemented our own power calculator, which calculates average power based on main engine RPM and main engine turbocharger RPM to get a much more reliable and realistic pattern. And what you can see here is that the impact on the SFOC of the vessel changes as well. So the dark blue data points again for the same time period see a lot of scatter and much of it in very unrealistic ranges. Whereas after the power calculator was implemented, you can see things in a much more realistic and ideal range. Again, better insights or better data yields better insights, and you can start focusing on more high impact performance initiatives. So how did we do all of this? I think a lot of this was enabled through our Navfleet software. Navfleet is a total ship operations platform by Navtor that helps clients simplify fleet monitoring, improve data quality, reduce consumption emissions, and increase operational efficiency, as well as easing a lot of the regulatory compliance challenges that we all face. We follow the very similar data collection and validation strategy that we discussed earlier, and we complement this with a robust analytics suite that helps companies make more informed decisions. And so we believe in a very simple, flexible onboarding process. Again, per the strategy, it's important to have something that's flexible that can meet the objectives of every client, because not every client looks at problems the same way or has the same pain points. And so that flexibility is critical in the onboarding phase. We believe that data is everything, and so having an exhaustive data validation system in place is critical to, again, meeting your performance goals and objectives. And then having decision support tools, not just data visualization tools, is very important in terms of helping improve decision making. And then finally, a flexible integration approach. So we mentioned the pros and cons of manual data, the pros and cons of automated data. And so having flexibility to capture either manual or automated or a combination of both is really important in what we do. So we have the ability to flexibly integrate any type of data that you require. And then also the ability to push that data to third parties, thereby centralizing data connection and providing a more integrated systems approach is important also for that kind of single source of truth that people are increasingly seeking. I think we're a little bit tight on time, so I'll quickly breeze through these so we have enough time for some Q&A. But as I mentioned earlier, it's important to be able to start off in the right place. And so Navtor builds a digital twin of every vessel, and we use that information as the basis for not only setting up the reporting forms, but also as a basis for our validation approach. And so in this case, you can see kind of in a vessel settings, not only are we identifying the vessel particulars based on information like sea trial data, shop test records, propeller curve and manual, capacity plans, etc. We're also looking at what equipment is on board and available and whether it's functional or reliable. And so the reliability of that equipment, again, matters a lot in terms of your data quality. And so we have ways of being able to work around, for instance, if the vessel doesn't have a torsion meter, we have a way to be able to still calculate an effective power in the absence of certain measuring equipment. So we don't believe that you should have to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in measuring equipment just to have decent data. And then again, the validation system is critical. So we have not only a series of basic validations, but we also have vessel-specific validations through the system, and quite a few cross-validations that, again, are pushing a higher quality of data. And we employ what's called a dual layer validation approach. So several hundred validations within the system help reduce errors at the point of entry. But then we also have a very high-powered performance team that are reviewing these kind of a monitoring center, if you will, on a 24/7 basis, and then providing kind of direct feedback to the vessel for any outliers, which we think is, again, critical to being able to capture nuanced data quality issues. And then finally, with better data, you're able to shift your focus to more high impact performance and compliance projects. So again, whether you're a commercial stakeholder, operational stakeholder, technical, or whether you sit in the C-suite and are worried about kind of GHG or other things that you need to report to your shareholders, the data quality really underpins everything that happens downstream of that and gives you a lot more confidence and the ability to do more interesting things with that data. Here's an example of a whole performance report that's capturing this information, validating on a regular basis. And so using this condition-based monitoring approach and trending reliable data, the recommendations for, say, a hull cleaning for this vessel really are effective. So the worst thing that could happen is you either have a vessel that believes that, okay, I see my excess consumption going up, so my gut tells me that there's a need for a cleaning. That is an approach, and we see that often. There's also, again, the approach of a system that's out there with bad data or no data validation process, which we've seen a system make a recommendation for a hull cleaning, and then when the diver goes down, they say, well, the hull's clean. So you've made a decision based on bad data, an expensive decision at that, and so that undermines the confidence in the process. So it's really important here. And then finally, from an emission and compliance perspective, having your CII data or even EU MRV and IMO DCS compliance, really important that data feeds into that and that you have real insights and valuable insights in terms of where your vessel sits on that spectrum. And then again, what can you do about it? So that really is the conclusion of my presentation. I hope you found it helpful. Again, I think summary here is that historically, companies have used very simplistic methods of reporting, but digitalization, regulation, and other factors have increased the uptake of modern platforms. So accurate and timely data is the basis for providing actionable insight that are ideally designed to help optimize a vessel's performance and supporting compliance efforts. It's important not to underestimate the importance of change management. So you could have the best strategy and the best process, but if everyone in the organization, including vessels, have not bought into the program, then it can all be for naught. And so good data quality is good, and it can have very positive impacts on decision-making, productivity, and the overall competitiveness of your business. Bad data is bad for your business, so it can undermine confidence. There are chances that you miss opportunities in the market. So data should be treated as an asset. And then also bad data in the end can decrease productivity, but also hurt morale. So if you have valuable resources spending all of their time following up and doing data checking and manipulation, it can over time be a very frustrating thing for these companies. So that concludes my presentation, Carl. I guess it's time for some Q&A.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Okay, so we're now going to the Q&A session. We don't have any questions yet, but I've got a big list of them here, so I'll start asking my questions while you think of yours. But the first question comes to mind. So shipping companies already have engine technical experts. In my experience, just about every company has people who really know engines inside out. Maybe someone who's been a chief engineer and has thought about nothing but ship engines for decades, but they haven't thought about vessel performance data because that's a comparatively new subject. So I was sort of thinking through what they need to change. Are these people who already know the engine power curves and all these terms that you use, but they're not used to reporting it? I don't know if you have any thoughts about where companies specifically need to get to if they already have engine experts on their staff, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's obviously the best and the greatest starting point. So mostly this becomes then a systems-based approach where it's important for companies just to empower them with the right systems. And so a way to be able to capture that information consistently and then analyze it consistently is really what matters at that point. So it's not a matter of kind of teaching them necessarily the methodology or how to analyze it. It's more so giving them the tools to make it easier for them to do this. And I think more quickly is the biggest thing. So what we've found is that, again, companies may have large technical teams with a lot of different with technical superintendents. So they all already know, they see this and they can interpret it much better than you or I would, but they're also chasing 100 other different tasks daily. So are you giving them the right systems to be able to look at this and make quick decisions? And I think that's what's critical that needs to happen there, not so much training them on how to analyze the information, because I don't think it's necessarily rocket science. So their experience is really valuable in kind of getting the most out of a program like this.
Yeah. And then on the customer side, when a sort of question crossed my mind, I mean, I don't know how far customers are probing. They're not asking to see people's data at this kind of granularity. They're asking, what was your emissions of CO2 from this last voyage you did, or how much fuel do you use? And if you say, I emitted a ton of CO2, maybe nobody knows any better. So I was sort of wondering, I mean, in terms of negative consequences, if people have bad data, considering companies have been reporting bad data for years and nobody noticed, and what actually happens if you
Yeah.
companies get more probing in what they're looking at? And
yeah, I think, again, historically, charterers haven't necessarily had a way themselves to validate a lot of information. So you're taking this kind of in somewhat of a best faith way when you're, say, setting up a vessel for charter, or you're evaluating whether you want to take a vessel on. So now I think they're becoming a little bit more savvy and have better tools to be able to evaluate this themselves. And so if you've had a culture of kind of misreporting, it becomes more and more difficult over time to continue in that, given that charterers or those that are using the information have become a little bit smarter. Again, there's still, I think, steps that the industry needs to take to improve transparency. We have one customer that's a notable charter in the Asia Pacific region. And what they've actually done is increase transparency with them in their charter. So they said, look, we know the industry historically has had a very difficult, between owners and charterers, has been a very difficult relationship. We want to open up this platform to you, the owner, so you can see that what I'm looking at and you're looking at are the same things. We both have a common interest here. in improving performance and kind of achieving a lot of our goals when it comes to CO2 emissions as well. So we'll open this platform up and allow you to see what we're looking at, and thereby it kind of encourages and incentivizes the owners to share a little bit more, knowing that, hey, you're not trying to hammer me with a claim at the end of this. We're both kind of trying to work towards a similar goal here.
Well, that's great. Well, we've got a couple of questions here, both from women, which is quite unusual in a ship engine presentation. So Caitlin Berg, who is asking about how you make your digital twin and what kind of digital twin, what kind of data you use. Is it just data from a form, or do you want to start with that one, do you think?
Yeah, sure. So typically we ask for a series, we use the technical specifications of the vessel. So we're collecting some public data with regards to the vessel specifications, but also sea trial data, shop test records, propeller curve and manual, general arrangement plan and capacity plan, and then historic data as well. So we use a combination of the technical data and historical data to formulate our speed, powering, and engine models, as well as our speed and fuel models. And then we have a calibration process where we're looking at and calibrating our models kind of on a kind of predictable intervals using data that comes in from the vessel. And so it's kind of a combination of approaches as to how we build and maintain our digital twin.
Very good. So then we're going to Greece. Isabella Koustas, I think she's a mechanical engineer with Metis, but she's asking if data, if you've manipulated it or corrected it, is that going to be compliant? That's a very complicated question. I've heard about these sort of blockchain related schemes that prove that nobody manipulated any data, but maybe the data was wrong in the first place and it needed some manipulation and correction. Do you have any thoughts on that question?
No, I think it's a fantastic question, and probably a little bit out of my remit. I probably have the same question. And so I think, again, the challenge is you have examples of things like the Poseidon principles, for instance. So these are banks that are making lending decisions based on kind of the environmental efficiency of vessels. And so historically, they were relying on that information to be provided by, say, a ship owner. And so that data very well could have been altered or filtered or even manipulated to kind of set a certain standard with the banks. And the banks, again, they're not in this industry the way that we're in this industry. So they almost have to kind of take it at face value. We're seeing that now the requirement is to have a validated report from an independent kind of verifier or a third party. This, in theory, should increase the burden of data quality on the shippers. However, honestly, I don't think that they're still there yet. I think there's still probably ways that you can pass on misinformation, not in the same way that maybe you could before, but I think there's been an acknowledgement by those using the data that it's still imperfect. And so trying to get to a point where it's been verified and that it's actually reflecting reality, I think is still kind of the goal, but not one where we as an industry have gotten to yet.
Oh, how easy is it to detect bad data? And if you're an expert and you look at it all the time, and can you tell in a split second, or you're going to be making models like this to show? I mean, just wondering from a charter's perspective, if you're submitting data to Sea Cargo Charter, can people there, do you think they'd spot immediately if the data was bad, or it's quite hard to tell sometimes?
I think if you trend the data, it's extremely easy. If you're looking at an individual data point and say you don't know the vessel, it may be hard. So you may not have a way of knowing if an MR tanker consuming, I don't know, 15 tons a day or 20 tons a day is right or wrong, and how are you going to tell the difference between a decimal here or a decimal there? And so I think you do need to be able to cross-validate and trend it in some way. So there were some examples that we could have also brought in and showed that were really interesting, or just speed and consumption curves. And so theoretically, you know that as you increase speed, consumption will naturally increase. So it should follow like an exponential curve. We've seen a lot of historic data that regardless of speed, consumption stays 100% flat in historic data. And so if you were to plot that, you don't have to be an expert to very quickly spot, hey, this doesn't make sense. I drive a car. I know if I go faster or accelerate faster, I'm going to burn more fuel. So you can see it in that way, but it becomes difficult if you're looking at individual data points. So there needs to be some analysis done on this. But again, if you set up your tools in the right way, it's not very difficult to spot. I think the more nuanced comes in when you're doing things like power in the absence of reliable measuring equipment, making sure that you have enough cross validations or alternative calculation methods in place to get the data right. That's really, I think, the tricky part that requires a little bit more expertise.
Yeah, and I think the trend over the next 10 to 20 years, this is going to get far more important. So people will look at it sort of similar to financial data, I suppose, where it gets similar levels of scrutiny, and people are going at it that deep and very good at spotting things that don't add up, I guess is what we're going to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's the big thing. And again, I think there's also not necessarily a standard in how everybody looks at it and validates data, which is why we think that that strategy is important. And so if you have more information as an owner or technical manager or charter, when you're planning this out, you can start to make sure things are done on a more apples to apples basis. So I think the way we validate data may be different than the way our competitor A or competitor C validates the data. And so that sometimes is where the tricky part comes in evaluating all the different options out there.
Oh, that's very good. You can stop sharing your screen if you like, and people can see you larger on the screen if you like. And yeah, I was just wondering about the software approach, because that's very interesting. But you mentioned software and services, so it's partly consulting and partly software. I mean, people don't necessarily need to buy big, complicated software, but they need to have like tools. So it could be an approach with lots of little tools to analyze pieces of data. But maybe Navtor doesn't mind if it's I guess both approaches can work. Is that something that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think over time we've come to this realization to where before it was kind of you should have the whole you should have the everything and the kitchen sink, and so all the bells and whistles were something that we always thought was what was really important. But over time we've started to realize that I think it's just very important to get started. And so what we offer is a modular service that allows you to do something that's very basic, is just, hey, I need to collect my data in a smarter way, and I want to make sure that it's validated. And I would rather use my own internal tools, whether it be an internal BI tool or even a third-party system to analyze it. And so giving that flexibility to, as you said, be able to kind of add bits and pieces is really important for us. And again, that flexibility matters. So we offer a modular program where you can just do reporting and validation only, or you can also add on other kind of performance-oriented modules around hull performance monitoring, engine performance monitoring, kind of a monthly KPI scorecards, or either kind of other integration services around compliance and emissions. And so I think any company looking at this should ideally look for the most flexibility to be able to pick and choose based on, again, what's important for them. There's not a one size fits all approach. And I think we certainly recognize that over the last few years.
Well, so we've got a question here from Panos Goulas, who's also from Metis in Greece. He's asking about, are we sure we're not going to miss an indication of equipment malfunction while filtering the data? I don't think you mentioned filtering the data. I've heard it mentioned in other data quality things where you see bad data and you just leave it out. I don't know if that's something you don't necessarily need to filter any data out. Who is it?
No, yeah, it's certainly a filtering process that happens. So there's also ways to be able to kind of trend and filter data to look for offsets or other things that could lead to malfunction. So we did have another example of a malfunctioning flow meter and the scatter there. And so I think whatever validations that you have should consider the possibility, or the reality is that even the best, most sophisticated equipment will inevitably break down or need calibration. And so your validation process should consider that that's a possibility and look for things like either offsets or just pure malfunction when validating. And ideally you have triggers or alarms that will notify you of that. And so we've seen situations where they're collecting the data, and if you would take the time to look at it, you would see that the equipment had malfunctioned, but there were no alarms set. So they just assumed it was business as usual. So definitely important to have the validations to risk kind of either misinformation or filtering this information thinking it's bad when in effect it could just be a malfunctioning equipment that just needs calibration.
Well, very good. So we've got the big technical questions coming in now. So Yoshio Otagaki is asking about how you can tell if there's wind, waves and currents influencing the data. How do you filter that? But I suppose the answer is you've got this range you expect the data to be in, and whatever the wind happens, that'll move it within the range, but not outside it. Is that how you'd answer that?
Yeah, exactly. So for us, we take into account, we obviously have vessel reported weather, but we also take into account third-party weather information in the analysis. And so we apply, as I think most would, a series of filters based on weather. So severe weather conditions, you typically would struggle to analyze or normalize that data. Any data points that fall within certain weather conditions, we typically will look at that kind of as is, and then we'll also normalize the effects of that weather in our analysis. So you try to get everything to make sure it's an apples to apples comparison versus, say, analyzing a data point with an adverse current versus one with a favorable current. You ideally want to be able to normalize that and look at kind of that data point under kind of good weather conditions.
Wow, yeah, I think there's a lot of people struggling with these questions. I think,
yeah, it's definitely not an easy one, and probably I don't know if my finance degree is the best one to give the specifics on that, but yeah, we have a lot of smart people that are doing our modeling, and so definitely something that is very important. I think weather has the biggest influence on performance in general, and so the weather question is a critical one, and certainly matters a lot when you're performing your, if you've collected data well, it's all correct, it's all truthful. The next big thing is you have to focus on how you filter that data, and so weather will hugely influence your analysis or the takeaways on that data set.
Okay, so we're going to Trieste in Italy now for Marco Alberto Grimaldi, Decarbonization Modeling Manager at Wärtsilä, according to his LinkedIn page. Do you care about transients? I guess that's sort of a data point that doesn't fit. Or can you ignore them during the validation? I guess that's a bit of a judgment call. What is it? I don't know if that's a...
Yeah, I think it kind of varies. So our system kind of is a smart system so that we basically try to learn as we go as to what kind of, ideally you're trying to incorporate as many of the data points as possible. So you want to try to filter out fewer data points, because again, the more you filter out, the longer it takes to get reasonable data sets. And so I think can become very kind of situation specific on whether those types of data points are used or not used or filtered in a process.
Oh, perhaps if we go in a different direction and talk about the charter aspect, you mentioned the sea cargo charter, and I went through their report where they had all these shipping companies and a graph showing whether the data was going up or down. And I guess the question rises, are they all reporting the right data? And you also got to separate the quality of the data reported from the quality of the actual improvement in the emission, which is an entirely separate subject, isn't it? I don't know if you work much with charterers or people's reporting to sea cargo charter. I think it's a very interesting subject, though. I don't know if you've got anything you've seen in what companies are asking for, or how it's getting more demanding.
Yeah, no, for sure, it's getting more demanding. We've added modules ourselves, kind of on kind of click and ready sea cargo charter reports, and so a lot of our customers are signatory to the sea cargo charter. And so again, I think the great thing with this kind of initiative is that the goal here is ideally to increase transparency coming out of the industry. I still do think that the challenge is the information that you produce. Again, our customers will use Navtor for data collection and validation. The other companies would have their own systems in place. And so again, as I mentioned before, I think the challenging part, and I've heard some comments from some of our customers that are part of it, is that if they've employed a very strict process for collecting and validating the data, and say they may not always look great from a performance or emissions perspective, but they've been transparent and honest, they see others that are kind of shown in more of a positive light, but they suspect issues with whether they've reported fully and accurately. And so I think that's still kind of one of the challenges of that charter, and it's not limited to there. So really having a better way to kind of compare companies and fleets on an apples to apples basis. I think it's still something they're not fully there yet. And I think there's a recognition that they're not there, but trying to get to a more kind of standardized way of looking at it, I think matters. And for people wanting to participate, we've seen some companies that are kind of thinking about it, but not fully committed for that very reason. Hey, why should I be penalized for being transparent when I don't believe that necessarily others are? So I think that's kind of one of the limiting factors there.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult because I suppose people have got a commercial reason to lie, and they've got a commercial reason to be suspicious of the data they're being given, isn't it? So, well, I suppose a sea cargo charter will have to find out ways to satisfy themselves that their data is good.
Yeah, exactly.
Mature, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as the last point and kind of my quick summary was that buy-in is critical, and so we've seen. And I've heard this from some of our colleagues and the other performance companies as well. I think that change management can't be underestimated, is that at some point the industry needs to say, look, we're going to report what is the reality here, and then we'll deal with it. We're not going to put, say, pool points first. We're not going to put kind of, obviously everybody cares about profitability, but they also care about necessarily actually reducing their environmental footprint and their impact on the environment. And so it's a definite step change from historical approaches, and something that I think people just kind of have to pull the Band-Aid and be committed to. Because at the end of the day, once you recognize where your inefficiencies are and you ideally rectify it, you don't have to kind of go for long with necessarily being penalized for poor performance. But again, that becomes a very tricky commercial discussion among shipping companies as to when and how you make that transition, because it's not an easy one to sacrifice kind of business profitability in the short term just to try to get your data up to a certain standard.
Yeah, it's a comment here from Yoshio Otogaki. He's saying we have to take bad data out if we're going to make good decision making. I suppose I guess that's a whole discussion about this. How do you know what bad data is so you eliminate it? I suppose that's almost
no.
Clear point.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. You have to eliminate it to improve decisions. And so ideally you're collecting your validations, create good data. And at that point, you're only filtering out kind of noise, that noise again coming from severe weather conditions or other kind of odd operational conditions that are, say, not normal. You're ideally filtering those out versus, say, just trying to look for the handful of good data points that are there. Because again, if you have a basket of bad data, then do you handpick a couple of good data points, and how do you believe that those are actually true and accurate, whereas the rest are bad? So ideally you say, okay, I know that I've implemented a standardized process for validating the data. I know that my approach has created roughly accurate information. And so at that point, my filtering can be done, again, based more on operational and weather conditions, not on whether I believe the information or not.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're coming up to the time's up. There's another question I was going to ask you about this edge analytics. You dropped in it somewhere. I don't know if you'd have imagine some computer system on the board that would say this fuel consumption data you're providing is wrong. Don't send that to the head office. Is that kind of what you mean by edge?
Yes, essentially. So for us, I didn't talk a whole lot about kind of the Navtor digital ecosystem, but we have what's called Navbox hardware on board. And we work with a lot of kind of notable data collection companies as well. And so the ability to pull that data in and communicate with the sensors on board, auto-populate noon reports at kind of locally on the vessel, and then also analyze and provide that feedback on the vessel is certainly an option and a pathway. And we're seeing the evolution of the industry to that point. So by collecting and analyzing information on the edge, not only are you able to provide kind of instant feedback to the vessel, but you're also not dependent upon bandwidth, connection, or latency issues that are still very commonplace in the industry. And so it's certainly a path, I would say, to quicker feedback and advanced. And so it's something that we are actively doing and looking at as well. Again, that's not without its challenges as well. It can be logistically more complex. time consuming or expensive, but it's certainly a way to overcome a lot of these challenges and start to empower the vessels a little bit more to make kind of real-time decisions versus having to rely so much on shore teams for that guidance.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I guess that brings us to the end. I think you've done an amazing talk on a new subject. You presented a lot of new material, and I can see it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Dallas. So you've got a whole
Yeah, I'm wide
ahead
awake.
of
I'm
you
wide
already.
awake now. I have the whole day ahead.
Hope it's not going to be too exhausting. But
Yeah.
thank you very much, and I shall pass back to Farah for the closing words. Cheers.
Thank you, Carlos. Cheers.
Wow.
Thank you to our guest speaker, Aaron Holton from Navtor, and to all our viewers. We'll be sending you a YouTube video link soon with his email if you have any further questions. Join us for our next digital ship webinar with Smart Ship Hub on the 17th of November, which is called Condition Monitoring of Machinery and Should Insurers Take an Interest, which you can book online at the Digital Ship website. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.